So glad that you're joining us. It's good to be together. I'm going to go ahead and get started. My name is Laura Park. I'm the Director of Membership and Hospitality at Unity Church-Unitarian, and this is Wellspring Wednesday. Wellspring Wednesday at Unity Church gathers an intergenerational, multi-generational church community to nourish right and holy relationship among us and deepen our life of faith, grounded in spiritual practice and anti-racist multicultural work. Every Wednesday, the experience includes sharing meaningful time and when the mask mandate is lifted, and it will be someday, nourishing food together, brief multi-generational worship beforehand, and opportunities to play, learn, and practice with one another. And tonight, our opportunity is to spend some time with the history teaching team. And I'd like to introduce you to the team who is spotlighted on your windows tonight. So we have Bill Wittenbrier with us, Kirsten Fisher, Krista Hansen, and we are all giving extra props to Krista because she did the PowerPoint and took all these last minute changes from us. We are particularly grateful to you, Krista. And Shelley Butler is going to wave, and Jim Oberly. This is our history teaching team with us tonight. And before we get started, I'm going to light the chalice and do an opening reading. The poem that I'm going to read is Bell Rope by Robert Morgan. The line through the hole in the dank vestibule ceiling ended in a powerful knot, worn slick, swinging in the breeze from those passing. Half an hour before service, Uncle Alan pulled the call to worship, hauling down the rope like the starting cord of a motor, and the tower answered and answered as the clapper lolled aside. I watched him before Sunday school heave on the line as on a well rope, and the wheel creaked up there as heavy buckets emptied out their startle and spread a cold splash to farthest coves and hollows, then sucked the rope back into the loft, leaving just the knot within reach, trembling with its high connections. So our topic tonight is our sesquicentennial roots. We're going to cover about 50 years of history before we laid the cornerstone of Unity Church-Unitarian in its current location. And we hope that it gives you a sense of where we come from and in a sense too of how we've been formed as a congregation. And we're going to begin tonight by acknowledging the land that we are on. And I'm going to turn it over to Jim Oberly to get us started.
Thank you. And thank you, Laura, and welcome to everybody. So yes, let me begin. Each week when we gather for worship, either in person in the sanctuary or online, our clergy reads aloud Unity Church-Unitarian's Land Acknowledgement Statement. Our statement has 4 parts to it, and each part has a history. The first part you can see on the screen reads, quote, "We stand on the historic lands of the Dakota and Ojibwe nations," end quote. Let me unpack that statement a bit by referring to the map you can see on the screen. The map was drawn by Charles Royce, an official in the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs. Almost 150 years ago, Royce was given the task by the Commissioner of Indian Affairs of drawing a map of every treaty or agreement between the United States and tribal nations. Look at the way that Royce drew the lines in present-day Minnesota. The parcel marked number 242, and Laura, an aside here, can you move your cursor over 242 near Mora, Minnesota to show people? There you go. 242 is part of a 13 million acre tract that the United States obtained from the Ojibwe Nation at the treaty signed at Fort Snelling in 1837. The parcel marked 243, if you could show us that one, was part of a 5 million acre tract that the United States obtained by treaty also in 1837 with the Dakota Nation. The parcel marked 289, thank you, was part of a 30 million acre tract that the United States obtained by treaty from the Dakota Nation in 1851. Our Portland Avenue church building sits on the lands that were acquired by the United States in Royce Session number 243. But some of Unity's congregation lives in that session area. Some live or work or enjoy recreation in Session 242 to the north of the Twin Cities. Some of the congregation lives in Royce Session 289, which includes the present-day city of Minneapolis. In signing these treaties in 1837 and 1851, the United States recognized that the tribal nations were the rightful owners of these lands. Until 1837, non-natives were forbidden from entering these territories. Once the United States acquired the lands in sessions number 242, 243, and 289, it quickly moved to transform them from public lands into private property by pricing the land at $1.25 an acre. To give some idea of the value of the land in Royce Session number 243, the Ryan companies paid $500,000 per acre, $500,000 per acre, to buy the land on the old Ford plant site in Highland Park. Laura, can we go to the next slide, please? Thank you. Okay, here are two other session maps drawn by Charles Royce and published back in 1897. They're not about Minnesota, but they show you the range of the sessions. Royce Session number 1, that's at the top left in green. If you could move your cursor there, Laura. That maps the lands in present-day Pennsylvania sold by the Six Nation Iroquois to the United States in 1784. Now look at Royce Session number 718 in Washington State. That's at the lower right. That was an acquisition by the United States of what was part of the Coville Indian Reservation a century later in the 1890s. Now, the United States claims sovereign control of all of its territory from 1783 onward for purposes of conducting international relations. In other words, the U.S. forbade tribal nations from conducting diplomacy with foreign nations. However, the United States also acknowledged that occupancy of land was different from sovereign power. The U.S. needed a relinquishment of occupancy, usually via a land cession treaty, like in 1837 and 1851 in Minnesota, from the native nations living on those lands. This is how what's the present-day United States was transformed from native country to the U.S. public lands and then to private property, stretching over 718 different treaties. In 1837, the land on which Unity Church stands went from United States recognized Dakota Nation land to U.S. public land. The lands that became the city of St. Paul and of Minnesota were surveyed in 1849 into rectangles that we recognized when we fly over, and we see that checkerboard pattern as we look out the airplane window. The land was soon sold thereafter at $1.25 an acre and passed from public lands into private property. In sum, it was not just the bayonet or the musket by which the United States seized the lands of tribal nations, but the use of pen and ink by diplomats negotiating and signing treaties. Laura, could we go on to the next slide? Thank you. All right, our land acknowledgement statement continues, quote, "We honor with gratitude the people who stewarded the land throughout the generations," end quote. Let's look at the map of the land surrounding the present-day Twin Cities. The Dakota people say they have been here from time immemorial. Don't ask them for a date when they settled here. They have been here and cared for the land and resources from time immemorial. The Ojibwe people, up in 242 at the top, they're kind of cut off. The Ojibwe people will tell you they are migrants to present-day Minnesota. Their ancestral home was on the St. Lawrence River in present-day Quebec, but well before the voyage of Christopher Columbus, the Ojibways received a sign from their creator to follow a seashell in the sky westward. The shell reflected light and warmth all the way from the Gulf of St. Lawrence to present-day Madeline Island, Lake Superior. We of Unity Church are the beneficiaries of the land stewards who came before us, who they protected the water, the forest, and the lives of all the beings in this area. All right, our land acknowledgement statement continues. Third statement. Third phrase, we acknowledge the ongoing injustices that have been committed against the Dakota and Ojibwe nations, unquote. Let's look at that Royce land cession map again from 1897. I mentioned the United States sold the lands in these territories for $1.25 an acre. Royce number 242 and 243 were filled with pine trees, by one estimate about 100 billion board feet of white pine in 1837. Royce 289 to the south and west of the Twin Cities contained some of the richest farmland in the world when it was put under the plow after 1851. The United States paid the Ojibwe 6 cents an acre. You heard that right, 6 cents an acre for number 242. The Dakota, 7 cents an acre for number 243, and 10 cents an acre in 1851 to the Dakota for number 289. 6 cents, 7 cents, 10 cents. Those payments didn't continue forever. The payments to the Ojibways were spread over 20 years, and then they ended in 1857. The payments to the Dakotas were supposed to go into a trust fund to be kept by the United States in perpetuity, forever, but forever ended in 1863 when the United States seized the assets in the trust fund to punish the Dakota Nation for the uprising in Minnesota of 1862. More than a century later, U.S. courts acknowledged that in all three treaties, the United States negotiators engaged in what the courts called unconscionable dealings. That was the phrase from the 1970s, unconscionable dealings with tribal nations. The courts ordered the United States in the 1970s to pay reparations, just compensation to the descendant Ojibwe and Dakota tribal bands. However, just compensation, as the U.S. courts define it, was not $500,000 an acre as at the Ford site in Highland Park, or $900 billion, just shy of $1 trillion. That would be the present day value of the pine trees acquired in Royce Sessions 242 and 243. But rather, the court said, the United States, you should pay what you should have paid in 1837 or 1851, $1.25 an acre. And this is within the lifetimes of many of us here tonight. The 1970s, $1.25 an acre. That was the reparations, the damage payments the tribal nations received. And the U.S. courts were clear. There'd be no interest to be paid on that debt that had been pending for 140 years. $1.25 an acre was it. And I think other Unitarian church members would call that an ongoing injustice, as we say in our land acknowledgement statement. Unity Unitarian's land acknowledgement statement closes this way. We intend to interrupt this legacy with healing and honest storytelling about this place, unquote. And now let's listen to some stories about the people who brought Unitarianism and Universalism to Minnesota. Let's hear some honest storytelling about this place. Laura, back to you.
Thanks so much, Jim. And I'm actually going to turn it now over to Bill Wittenberger, who's going to give us some of that religious and economic context for the founding of Unity Church. Take it away, Bill.
All right. Got about 50 years to cover in about 20 minutes. Okay. In the 1850s, steamboats docking at the lower landing were an everyday sight in St. Paul. Over 1,000 boats were arriving each year. I should mention that shipping season was when the river wasn't frozen. These boats were the lifeblood of the young city and also its future. The Big Bend on the river downtown is the largest natural harbor on the upper Mississippi, and navigation was not possible beyond the bend. There were huge rapids where the Ford Dam is located, and that prevented rapids from going upriver to the fledgling villages of St. Anthony and Minneapolis. Railroads had not yet reached St. Paul, but they had extended to the Mississippi at Rock Island and La Crosse, Wisconsin. And there they emptied their cargoes onto the boats steaming to St. Paul. St. Paul was becoming the economic heart of Minnesota and beyond. This booming economy is what attracted many of Unity's founders to try their hands in St. Paul. Various religious groups had taken root in St. Paul. The Catholics had been holding services in the city since 1841, and the Methodists and the Presbyterians were established by 1849. But in this mix of people, there were those who had an appetite for something other than these Orthodox religions. In 1852, a traveling Unitarian minister, a Reverend Woodward, preached at St. Paul's Sons of Temperance Hall, and over in Minneapolis, the Universalists had built a church in 1854, which is the present day Our Lady of Lourdes. In 1858, Benjamin Drew, the superintendent of St. Paul's schools, discovered the proprietor of the new feed business in town, Frederick Newell, had been a Unitarian minister in Boston. Drew persuaded Frederick Newell to preach, and Newell agreed if he could use his old sermons. Newell preached for about 10 months in the hall above the Pollock and Donaldson store on Robert Street, and later at the Good Templars Hall, which is also on Robert Street. Newell's preaching was the first sustained Unitarian presence in St. Paul. Newell may have been persuaded to return to the pulpit because he needed the money. In 1858, the impact of the 1857 financial panic was still being felt in St. Paul. We're not sure exactly why Newell quit preaching, but we do know that he joined the Union Army and fought in the Civil War. Information is sparse on St. Paul's early Unitarians. We know that in 1858, they had $92.40 in their treasury, or that's about $3,100 in today's money, and that attendance at Sunday services averaged about 30 people. We have the names of 16 people from this early group. William Kelly and his wife Henrietta would become lifelong members of this small group that would become Unity Church. Kelly kept a diary, and that would become a primary historical record of Unity's early days. Another early member was a Charles E. Mayo. Mayo was probably the Mayo in the hardware business of Mayo and Clark. Charles Mayo would later be instrumental in the founding of the St. Paul Library. The size of the treasury and some of the names associated with these early Unitarians suggest that some of the members were well off financially and were already leading members in St. Paul's emerging society. During the Civil War, 2 Unitarian ministers conducted services in St. Paul. In 1861, Reverend Vickers from Cincinnati held a service in the courthouse, as did Reverend Cutting from Winona 4 years later in 1865. After the Civil War, in 1865, another traveling minister visited St. Paul, a Reverend J. Augier. He arrived from Boston, but Augier did more than just preach. He helped organize the St. Paul Unitarian Society. This organizational meeting was held at the home of William L. Ames, which I might want to point out at this point is no relation to the Ames whose name is on our chapel in our present church. Those in attendance at this meeting were Channing Seabury and A.H. Wimbish, Mrs. H.W. Haynes, William H. Kelly, and J.S. Sewell. I should mention that Channing Seabury goes on to become the vice president of the Capitol Commission that built the building that is now the capital of Minnesota. William Ames, we would need the next slide, please. William Ames is an example of one of these well-connected, wealthy individuals who is active in St. Paul's nascent Unitarian society. These well-off connected individuals over time eased the way for the establishment of a Unitarian community in St. Paul. And next slide. And the next slide. This is the Ames House. Ames is another example of these well-off, well-connected individuals who were members of the early Unity congregation. Ames was the son of the founder of the Ames Shovel Works in Massachusetts. Shovels from the Ames Company were used by just about every Union soldier in the Civil War. Ames quickly, after coming to Minnesota, quickly established himself in a variety of businesses in St. Paul, and the census of 1870 lists Ames with about $60,000 in property holdings, or in today's dollars, that's about 1.3 million. In 1866, a small group of St. Paulites preferred to follow the tenets of Universalism. This young Universalist community purchased a lot at Wabasha and 9th and by 1872 had built a church. The Universalists had proposed a union between themselves and the Unitarians, but the Unitarians preferred to remain Unitarian. We really don't know the reason for this refusal to join this union, but we do know that for a period afterwards, this young Unitarian society floundered a bit. The society met in the home of William Mccauley and deemed it expedient to postpone for the present any further efforts to establish Unitarian preaching in St. Paul. End of the quote. However, by 1871, St. Paul's Unitarians had regained their confidence. And again, they met in the home of William Mccauley and pledged $1,305 or $30,000 in today's money towards sustaining Unitarian preaching for 1 year. Several days later, on October 28th, the St. Paul Society met with S.S. Huntington, the Western Secretary of the Unitarian Society, and organized themselves into a church. Huntington then proposed that he would send them a 3-month minister for this new church. Well, this 3-month minister was John F. Effinger. He arrived in 1872 and preached his first sermon on February 11th in Knopf's Hall at 7th and Olive Street. And I think 7th and Olive is about where that SA is downtown today. 2 weeks later, on February 25th, 1872, which is considered the official birthday of Unity Church, articles of association were drawn up and the Board of Trustees was named. And among the trustees was William H. Kelly, Edward Sawyer, and William Ames. The 1870s were challenging times for Unity Church. Membership was growing, and they soon outgrew Knopf's Hall and moved to a vacant church on Temperance Street. But they soon outgrew that space, and one of those funny ironies in history happened. Dissension amongst the Universalists caused them to vacate their church on Wabasha, and the Unitarians rented the space for about $1,000 a year. Shortly after this, Reverend Effinger announced his resignation due to a deteriorating health conditions, and William Ames died. So it's kind of a good news, bad news situation for a young parish. Key supporter dies, their first permanent minister leaves, but we persevered. The congregation was downhearted at best at the departure of Effinger. The 3-month minister had stayed 4 years. When William Lloyd Jenkins, the secretary of the Western Unitarian Society, proposed to Unity members that they consider approaching William Channing Gannett as a candidate for Effinger's replacement. Well, many at Unity felt that was very unlikely, if not impossible, a long shot. Nevertheless, the trustees began to correspond with Gannett, and he eventually agreed to come to St. Paul and to serve as Unity's pastors. But we'll hear more about Gannett later on tonight. In 1879, Unity needed to move again from the Universalist Church. The congregation was still meeting there, and it was adequate, but the Universalists wanted to sell. And at the same time, as a way to kind of hedge their bets, several lots were for sale at the nearby corner of Summit and Wabasha. Now, back in these days, Summit Avenue ran down the hill like it does today. And if you're familiar with those apartment buildings by the Historical Society, that's still Summit Avenue. Summit kind of wiggled away around the Historical Society building where it is now, and terminated at Wabasha Street. It's now probably right on the freeway. So the church formed a committee to secure the lots, just in case the negotiations to buy the Universalist Church fell through. The committee to purchase the lot was Edward Sawyer, O.P. Whitcomb, J.S. Sewell, and J.D. Loudon. An offer of $13,000 was made for the Universalist Church, but it was rejected. The lots were secured and a building committee was formed. This building committee consisted of J.D. Loudon, J.S. Sewell, Mrs. Frances Sawyer, Mrs. Martha Clark, and Reverend Gannett himself. The committee got together and decided that the building project could only go forward if they had $6,000 in pledges and that the church would assume a debt no greater than $3,000. Well, these monies were quickly raised towards the goal of $23,000. Roughly a third of these funds came from friends on the East Coast. And from what they called 8 outside friends in St. Paul, including James J. Hill, and the balance of the monies came from Unity members. Unity, once again, was fortunate to have well-connected and wealthy individuals amongst its members. Reverend Gannett and other parishioners, not saying that Reverend Gannett was wealthy, but Reverend Gannett and other parishioners utilized their connections in the East for the contributions. Edward Sawyer, who I mentioned, was an early business partner of James J. Hill. That may have been the connection from Mr. Hill's connection. Sawyer himself would eventually go on to become the treasurer of the Great Northern Railroad. And Francis Sawyer, along with Mrs. Martha Clark, used their network of friends to arrange that $3,000 loan that was necessary to have the construction of the church go forward. And they also raised an additional $7,000 to cover some unexpected construction costs they encountered when they were building the church. Apparently, they were building it over a peat bog. And Unity held its annual meeting in their new Queen Anne Church in 1882. Shortly after church was completed, William Channing Gannett submitted his resignation because he, quote, felt Unity needed a new minister and that he wanted to do some other things that had long been waiting, end quote. Over the next 15 years, Unity would have 4 different ministers: Clay Mccauley, Samuel Crothers, William Lord, and Clarence Diven. At first glance, one would think that the church was headed into yet another period of instability. This was not the case. Reverend Gannett, while at Unity, discovered the concept of a church home, a carefully planned interior to suit the social needs with the exterior of a home to reflect these needs. And maybe this concept of the church home provided the necessary confidence and stability that was needed for so many years to the Unity parish. Okay, Unity Church now began to turn their attention to cultivating programs for their congregants and charitable undertakings for the broader community. Unity was in a strong position. The 1885 treasurers lists 120 subscribers who contributed $1,933, Sunday collections of $141.57, and approximately another $550 from parish fundraisers. A popular fundraiser at this time was oyster suppers. In 1887, Unity and the First Unitarian Church in Minneapolis worked together to form the Minnesota Unitarian Society. At this time, Unity Sunday School was growing. In 1885, it had 84 students enrolled, 12 teachers for the curriculum. The curriculum the teachers used was The Teachings of Jesus, published by the Unitarian Sunday School Society of Boston. Charles W. Ames was the superintendent of the Sunday school. Charles Ames was a longtime active member of Unity Church. He served as church treasurer, Layman's League president, and president of the Minnesota Unitarian Society. Ames's day job was at West Publishing, of which he'd eventually become president of. And our chapel in our current building is named after Charles W. Ames, who again was not a relation to the earlier William Ames that we had. Unity's Benevolent Society helped needy women by providing them with work and clothing. The women were hired as seamstresses, and the clothes they made were given to the poor or sold inexpensively. The Lend a Hand Club was part of the Sunday school, and it distributed Thanksgiving baskets to the needy and Christmas gifts to the children at the orphanage, which may have been St. Joseph's, which is not far from the church on Wabasha Street. And next slide, please. Booker T. Washington came to Minnesota to speak at a gathering at Carleton College, but he also came to St. Paul to visit the legal counsel for his organization, St. Paul's first Black attorney, Frederick McGee. Washington also paid a visit to the ladies at Unity because they had been contributing financially to his Tuskegee Institute. Unity was also involved in the Temperance Movement, but we will hear more about that later. Next slide, please. We started the presentation with St. Paul as a river economy. In the 1880s, it was still prospering. It had transferred from a steamboat economy to a national railroad center rivaled only by Chicago. St. Paul, with the completion of the Northern Pacific Railroad depicted here in this triumphal arch, was the eastern terminal point of the railroad. St. Paul was now connected to the West Coast. All goods flowing to the west went through St. Paul. Things bode well for Unity's next move up the hill. And that's all I've got, Laura, so back to you.
That's fabulous, Bill. Thank you so much. So Bill mentioned that Unity Church was involved in the Temperance Movement, and Kirsten Fisher is going to tell us more about Unity Church's unique relationship with this movement and what it reflected about our history and about who we are. Kirsten.
Thanks, Laura. When Reverend William Channing Gannett came to Unity Church in 1877, he was already well known as a strong supporter of African American rights, of abolition of slavery, and of the vote for women. Those causes are admirable and easy for us to like today. Tonight, I thought I would share with you Gannett's passionate support for another cause, the Temperance Movement, which set out to reduce or even halt the consumption of alcohol. The way that Gannett went about this seems to me distinctly Unitarian. And so first I'll talk a bit about the Temperance Movement nationwide, and then I'll say what I think is really distinctive and Unitarian about the way Gannett himself proceeded. The campaign against alcohol was not new in the 1870s. In fact, by the time Gannett came to Unity, the Temperance Movement was already half a century old. The campaign to reduce or even stop alcohol consumption had a very long road to hoe because drinking hard alcohol was part of everyday life in artisan culture, among working class people, and also in the higher up echelons. It was part of the process of cutting deals, of leisure time, of political rallies. Alcohol was always present. In fact, in the mid-19th century, the average adult man downed half a pint of hard liquor a day, and the annual intake came to 7 gallons of hard liquor per capita. Per capita includes babies and children and women who are not drinking so much. So really it means that the average free man drank more than 7 gallons a year, which is about triple of today's rate. Women joined the temperance movement in large numbers because they saw alcoholism as a cause for domestic violence and the slide into poverty. Temperance reformers often used techniques that worked very well in religious revivals. Group confession and prayer, emotional conversion experiences, and heavy peer pressure for young men to confess, in particular young men to confess their vice, and then to take the pledge, to make a promise to abstain from all drinking. As part of this movement, lurid tracts like the ones you see on the screen were published that depicted the hazards of drinking. You can see on the left, the drunkard's home, which is full of violence, chaos, frightened children, everything tipped over. It's the propaganda against drinking alcohol, which was very standard for the day. On the right hand, you see the orderly patriarchal society. Everybody's in their place. The children are fed and clean and probably quiet as the husband reads from the Bible. In the middle, you see temperance on horseback. The horse's hooves have crushed open the barrels of rum and whiskey, which are really seen here as toxic. And a very warrior-like woman is is astride her steed. You see the American flag on her shield, and she's going to rescue the nation from the plague of alcoholism. So this kind of thing was going on all over the place. It had considerable success nationwide. The temperance movement attracted hundreds and thousands of supporters, many of them middle-class women who were taking political public action for the first time. And it worked. The average consumption of alcohol fell from 7 gallons of hard liquor per person a year to 2. And that within the course of only 15 years, the 15 years after 1830. The movement, of course, hoped very much to get that number eventually to 0. If we could have the next slide, please. So in this fervor, this national fervor for reform, it's not surprising that Unity Church also had a temperance movement within its congregation. But as I learned recently, Unity did not use the techniques of evangelical revivals to persuade its members to join or to sign the pledge. In fact, the process at Unity was very much aligned with the values of a liberal religious community in which each person is supported to find their own path toward truth, and the pledge was entirely optional. In fact, with a very, I think, remarkable leniency, everyone was welcome to join the Temperance Club at Unity, whether they chose to abstain fully, partially, or not at all. All are welcome here, may well have been their motto. So how do we know this? We know this because William Channing Gannett, whom you see here on the screen, did us the favor of writing a pamphlet called How We Got the Temperance Society in the Church, a story of what might be. This pamphlet is, which we hold in our own archive at Unity Church. This pamphlet is in the form of a dialogue between 2 people, and it opens with the question, how did you get that temperance society going in your church? You people aren't good at such things. And the responder, who is in effect Gannett himself, explains it wasn't hard. It began in 1880 with 6 people who wanted such a society, who invited 30 more, taking care to include some bright people, Gannett said, who would be sure to offer objections to their 2 proposed solutions. The first solution was only total disuse of intoxicating beverages can prevent the miseries and evils of intemperance. The second resolution, and this is a quote, we affectionately call on those who may regard their moderate use as innocent to give up such use out of compassion for their weaker brethren, unquote, which is in a sense saying the same thing. So 2 resolutions basically saying, let's give it up. Now, the first meeting that happened featured a very lively debate on purpose because they'd purposely invited people who they knew would disagree with the resolutions. The debate went till after 11 p.m. Word spread that it had been really lively and engaging. And then an invitation went out to anyone interested in continuing the debate. And they called it a debate, which is really different from, say, a conversion experience. It's a debate. They decided they would analyze the connections between poverty, crime, disease, and drinking, and that they would come up with practical methods of temperance reform. The invitation to this second debate expressly said that neither total abstinence nor a pledge of any kind were required for membership in the new Temperance Society. 80 people showed up. Some people weren't even members of the congregation, but people wanted to participate in this conversation. Again, both sides of the question of total abstinence received representation. There was a brisk debate, Gannett reported, although he said it was earnest and friendly, no mere arguing. So not arguing for the sake of arguing, but a real debate. Nearly all of the 80 decided to join the society, 47 of whom favored total abstinence. The next question was, should the teetotalers make a pledge to that effect? The non-totals, as Gannett called them, the non-totals sat listening while the totals hashed it out amongst themselves, the totals being those who favored total abstinence. Some felt that a pledge gave a feeling of a chronic feeling of bondage, not something a religiously free community should endorse. The problem with a pledge is it's binding. They also, what if you change your mind? What if you grow to a different position? Right? You have to leave open that search for truth. Those who did favor a pledge wondered about its proper length. A life pledge made no room for growth or change of opinion, and that seemed unwise. And certainly some people strongly felt that it was absolutely wrong to have children sign life pledges of total abstinence. Finally, the totalers, among whom Gannett counted himself, decided on a one-year pledge of total abstinence with optional annual renewals. Is that not just so familiar somehow? Anyway, then everyone joining, and there were 68 at this point, signed a book. There were also those who pledged. They put an A next to their name, A for abstinence. Children age 8 and older were invited to join as well. They signed in the same book as their parents. Children were expected to forego hard cider. Hard cider was the gateway drink of the age, presumably. The society members decided to call themselves the True Helpers, and they adopted 2 mottos: on honor, which you see here on this ribbon, which was found in one of Gannett's books, I believe, on honor, and for their sake. For their sake, gestures particularly to children, that one should abstain from alcohol so as not to do harm to the younger people in one's family. The society met 4 times a year. Twice they took the place of the regular Sunday school, and 4 new temperance worship services were added to the church calendar, explicitly devoted to the temperance question. At the 4th one, the society members again signed the book for another year of work, some with the A, some without the A, and some were not even members of Unity Church. They didn't want to join other temperance societies because of those burdensome lifetime pledges. But at Unity, as Gannett said, we welcome all. Women in the congregation were central to the Unity Temperance Movement. Gannett noted, for example, that it took the women with the men to brother or to tend 3 or 4 poor fellows back to hope and self-respect. 2 Unity women, savvy PR women, persuaded some wealthy people in town to host a party without wine, and then they published that praiseworthy fact in the local newspapers. Gannett at one point reported, "I don't believe there is a girl in our church now who thinks it womanly to take wine with a young man at parties." Meanwhile, the children raised money by performing plays, and in summer they kept an ice water barrel in front of the church. Car drivers driving home from work knew they could stop there for some ice water along their route home. The money from this went to the Thanksgiving baskets that Bill just mentioned, and also Christmas gifts for 6 families suffering from one person's drinking habit. When the weather turned cold, the children adopted a specific temperance baby and made sure to provide it with warm clothes and coal for the stove to keep the child warm. The point here was not to shame people for their alcoholism, but to help families in struggle. So while the 19th century temperance movement has been known for its puritanical goals, its evangelical feel, the zeal of it all, Unity Church had its own distinctly liberal, open-minded, tolerant, individualized, and totally voluntary version of the same. A temperance movement that adhered to the notion of individual choice, even while clearly encouraging its members to choose no. So I think this is a really fine example of a liberal religion translating its values into the world, remaining true to the notion of independent thinking and search for truth, while still supporting others to be their best selves. Back to you, Laura.
Thank you so much, Kirsten, for that deep dive into the temperance movement and how it played out at Unity Church. And for more on William Channing Gannett, I'm going to turn it over to Shelley Butler to take us through some of the ways that our ministry extended beyond our church.
Thanks, Laura. So you've heard a little bit about William Channing Gannett already, and you likely heard one of Rob's many sermons in which he mentioned Gannett. And if you're a member, you've recited Gannett's words about fellowship. But just how big a deal was William Channing Gannett to Unitarianism and Unity Church? Though Gannett was born and raised in the cradle of American Unitarianism, he felt to nationalize the religion, it would be necessary to de-Bostonize Unitarianism. He was among the second generation of transcendentalists. And as Dr. Boynton put it, Gannett was baptized with water by Channing. He was baptized in the spirit of Emerson. Theodore Parker also laid a spell on his youth and gave him the courage, the radicalism, and the deep human tenderness that marked all of his many years. His Harvard bio says that Gannett, like Emerson, thought Jesus was one man true to what is in you and me. And like Parker, he had an historical awareness that the heresies of one age become the orthodoxies of the next. It's been written that William Channing Gannett's stated vision of Unitarianism was the most comprehensively and notably conceived, the most justly and persuasively argued, the most ethically inspired, and the most beautifully expressed of all its kind in Unitarian history. To get there, he would be embroiled in and a major force in solving perhaps the most contentious disagreement of all its kind in Unitarian history. A colleague of Gannett remembered him in the furious controversy which rent the Unitarian body and which swung that church at last to the extreme left of theological radicalism. Dr. Gannett was in the van fighting fearlessly for those large liberties of thought, which are now the chief glory of religious liberalism everywhere. By 1970s, many churches in the West were founded or served by young ministers who were sympathetic to the radical Theodore Parker and the Transcendentalist, and Gannett and Jones were chief among them that became known as the Unity Men. No connection to Unity Church. But the story begins before we even became Unity Church, and this is just a brief, very brief version of it. American Unitarianism was not new. The American Unitarian Society had been formed 50 years before us. Ezra Stiles Gannett was its first secretary, our William Gannett's father. And the Western Unitarian Conference had been around 20 years before the birth of our church. While Unitarians were united in dedication to freedom in religion, for Christian Unitarians, that meant only freedom from more orthodox Christian superstitions and authority. So, despite much debate and fervent disagreements about it, the AUA amended its constitution in 1870 to read, reaffirming our allegiance to the gospel of Jesus Christ, we invite to our fellowship all who wish to be followers of Christ. Well, that didn't exactly settle anything for Gannett and the radicals. Next, the editor of the Christian Register, the big religious periodical of the day, asked all those who didn't accept Jesus to withdraw from the Unitarian body. And if that wasn't bad enough, George Fox, the secretary of the AUA, took it upon himself to write to several radical ministers asking if they wanted their names included in the yearbook, which was done annually. And given that they'd been asked to leave by the Christian Register, William James Potter wrote back to Fox that he wanted to be in the yearbook, but he was not a Christian Unitarian. Despite being a well-respected minister, Unitarian minister, the AUA removed his name from the 1873 yearbook. Enter our heroes and the Western Unitarian Conference, which denounced the AUA's action and resolved at its conference in 1875 that, quote, The Western Unitarian Conference conditions its fellowship on no dogmatic tests, unquote. Good friends William Channing Gannett and Jenkins Lloyd Jones were moving the Western Unitarian Conference into a new progressive area and a new kind of religious freedom. And it was about this time that Jones told our congregation that, as Bill said, he had just the right man for us. Gannett wasn't so sure himself. By the time Gannett first preached at Unity, he, Jones, and 4 other ministers were working on the founding of a publication which eventually came to be called Unity, the Pamphlet Mission, with the idea that it would be the liberal voice of the Western Unitarian Conference, an outlet for radicals. While Unity members hardly dared to hope that we could attract such a minister as Gannett, Gannett felt the need to warn us about himself. He would not call himself a Christian nor offer communion. He said that, quote, one like me is fairly outside the denomination, unquote. And a condition of his accepting the pastorate at Unity was that none of his salary should be paid by any monies from the American Unitarian Association. Unity was thrilled. He said yes. The Unity men envisioned a religion that was not based on belief, but on freedom, fellowship, and character in religion, which should sound familiar to all Unity members. Within a year of Gannett's first sermon at Unity, the first issue of the Unity publication came out. The prospectus said the publication would offer real freedom of mind, real fellowship between differing minds, and most important of all, character as the test and essence of religion, meaning as opposed to the kind of freedom Eastern Christian Unitarians believed in. This disagreement of the very nature of Unitarianism became known as the Creedal Issue, or the issue in the West, and came to be waged within the Unitarian Western Conference as well. The Unity men were accused of being a united, purposive, determined group, men they all loved and honored, that wanted to remove Unitarianism off its historic Christian base and away from the divine humanity that shone on Jesus Christ. This freedom, fellowship, and character stuff was, quote, reason gone mad, one minister wrote. This issue wasn't settled until after Gannett left Unity. Long story short, most eventually swayed to the left. Both sides grew weary of the fight. No one more so than Gannett, who brought both sides together in the Western Conference by writing a statement of faith called Things Most Commonly Believed Today Among Us. It talked about love, living a good life, working in unity, and reason and conscience as the final authority in religion. It did not mention Jesus or divinity or a test of fellowship. It passed by a vote of 59-13. The argument went on in the National Conference until both sides, including Gannett, acquiesced to include language in the Constitution that said Unitarians accept the religion of Jesus without mentioning divinity, and that nothing in the Constitution should be considered a test of fellowship. Unitarianism was changed forever. Gannett's awareness that the heresies of one age become the orthodoxies of the next was spot on. So back to Unity's, Gannett's first year at Unity. Gannett had been a minister for 10 years, but had never been ordained. So he asked the congregation to do so after about a year in. At that service, believed to be in the rented Universalist church shown on the slide, he introduced the bond of fellowship he had written, which incorporated the same language he and the Western radicals used on the masthead of every issue of the Unity publication. And that ensconced Unity Church firmly in the anti-Christian Unitarian camp, whether we knew it or not. He asked all who wanted to be members to say together, as those who believe in freedom, fellowship, and character in religion. And then those members were asked to sign the home book, the same membership book we've all signed today, and new members still sign. Gannett was well loved at Unity by old and young. Mabel Kendrick knew Gannett as a child and lived across the street from him in 1880. She left us a handwritten page of memories. Gannett was like an older brother to the children in the neighborhood and took she and other neighbor kids to Sunday school and church picnics. Once he brought a bunch of bananas to a picnic that was so large, none of the kids could lift it. He planned special church activities for them, like he fixed up a small house with curtains and chairs and filled it with all kinds of toys. And then the kids were invited to enter the house that Jack built, pay 5 cents, and take their pick of a toy. Mr. Gannett even took Mabel and some of the other kids to the circus and bought peanuts so they could feed the elephants. And Mabel mentioned the christening of a baby named Ralph Waldo Emerson Hagenwinkle. Gannett touched the baby's head with a rosebud, not unlike our dedication of new lives today. Perhaps out of his love for children, another contribution to the wider denomination were the Sunday school lessons and hymns that he wrote and published at Unity and beyond that were widely used. Gannett was an avid writer, poet, lyricist, hymn book editor, and published several books over his many years. He dedicated A Year of Miracle to for Unity Church, St. Paul. His lyrics were written to familiar tunes and reflected the new Unitarianism. For example, he rewrote lyrics to Holy, 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 Lord God Almighty, God in 3 persons, Blessed Trinity, to Bring, O morn, thy music, bring, O night, thy silence, ocean chant the rapture, to the storm wind coursing free. That's number 39 in our current UU hymnal. In the summer of 1883, Gannett declined the request to renew his ministry at Unity, saying, as Bill had said, he had a wish to do other kinds of work and believing that a new minister could do more. Anderson H. Wimbish, who signed the home book that very first year, said, I don't see how we are to do without him. Make every sacrifice to keep him in the bounds of reason or a little beyond the bounds of reason. We might run the church 1,000 years and not get a man that suits us so well in every particular. If we can't keep him after we've exhausted every effort, then give him up, but not before. Wimbish was so ardent in his admiration of Gannett that he once said, I divide all mankind into 2 classes. I put Gannett in one, all the rest into the other. Even though Gannett had fulfilled his wish to build a church home that he envisioned for what he called a family of families at Unity, it was not an easy process. And in the end, not everyone was happy with the building that looked more like a home than a church, as Gannett had wanted. Maybe he needed a break. Unity offered him a year of absence, but to no avail. Even so, as William Kelly told it, the society waited 15 months with the hope that Mr. Gannett would come back. And then on 23rd of October, 1884, authorized the trustees to engage Reverend Clay Mccauley for 6 months from November 1st. And now I'm going to pass it over to Krista, who's going to tell us more about our early history. Krista?
Thank you so much. So I'm going to briefly go through the next few ministers here, and there are biographies in the archives that give more detail, but I just wanted to highlight a few things about these ministers. So yeah, there was a gap of actually 2 years before from when Gannett left to when Reverend Clay Mccauley came. So he served Unity just for a year. He attended Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, and then graduated from Princeton in 1862. And I think it's interesting that to note that he served in the Union Army during the Civil War. And I got this picture of him from a House Divided website that Dickinson College put together. This is Pennsylvania, about people who were enrolled there who left to join the Union Army or left to join the rebels. And so he was listed as a white Northerner who was not a slave owner. And I just think that's really interesting for our history. And then he left Unity to become a Presbyterian minister and an educator in Japan. And that's a thing that we know, that sometimes people come to this faith from other traditions, and then sometimes they leave and go back perhaps, or go on to other traditions. And then here's his city directory entry. He was boarding at 77 Summit Avenue, which I don't believe exists anymore. Next slide. And then the Reverend Samuel McCord Crothers came in 1886. He followed. He was from Brattleboro, Vermont. He was well known when he came, and he often wrote for the Atlantic. In 1888, during his time at Unity, he helped spearhead the Minnesota Unitarian Conference, and representatives came from St. Paul, Minneapolis, Duluth, Winona, St. Cloud, Luverne, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and Alma, Wisconsin, which I think is very interesting. He left in 1894 and went back east to the First Parish Church in Cambridge, Massachusetts. Next slide. The next two ministers also served very short time. From 1895 to 1897, Reverend William Rogers Lord of Boston. He came to Unity Church, and again, only 2 years. He left kind of a mutual leaving. He had some maybe differences of opinion about how to serve the church. It was a mutual leaving. And he went on to become a minister at the First Unitarian Church in Portland, Oregon. I don't have a picture of him, but I have a picture in the top corner of his book. He became a noted ornithologist. And here is his book of birds for Oregon and Washington. So it is perhaps interesting that he maybe had other interests beyond ministering. And then on the left is a picture of Reverend Clarence Leslie Diven. Also served a very short time. He came from Connecticut. He resigned due to ill health, and he did actually die in St. Paul in 1900. And then Reverend Richard Wilson Boynton served Unity from 1900 to 1907. He was from Roslindale, Massachusetts. He graduated from Meadville Theological School in 1895, and he's kind of a big deal too. And his papers are at Harvard. So he's a known minister in the Unitarian world. Next slide. So we moved up the hill. We were downtown. Like Bill said, and the map showed, it's a place that doesn't exist anymore. It was right where 94 went through. So in 1902, the congregation felt a church in a new location was advisable. Although the Queen Anne building was still adequate, the neighborhood was becoming more commercial. As a result, many of the downtown residents were moving up on the hill, and their churches were following them. And that's information from William Channing Gannett's History of the Church. So the big move happened. 1905, here's the pictures of laying the cornerstone. So next time you come to Unity Church and look at that cornerstone, you'll go, oh, I know a little bit more about this now. So Unity Church at its present site at Portland and Grotto, the groundbreaking was on April 1st, 1905. The new church was dedicated on December 10th, 1905. Next slide. And I wanted to stop there because we said before the cornerstone, but of course I had to show you this awesome picture. So this is the original look of the church. Which is kind of fun to see, I think, knowing now the wraparound entrance that we have and the back addition and the house on the right is not there. That's where the garden is. This church was designed by architect Thomas Gannett Holyoke. I don't know if there's a Gannett connection. I'll have to ferret that out a little bit. He was born in Massachusetts and he died in St. Paul. In 1885, he was hired by Cass Gilbert and was his chief draftsman. In 1902, the two architects collaborated on the chapel at Roselawn Cemetery in Roseville. So that is Lavender and Victoria. If you ever see that, it's just very similar in the limestone that was used and the English Gothic style. Another church they collaborated on was the church that's at the foot of the Grand Hill. That's no longer a church. In 1904, Holyoke had his own independent practice. And so he was the sole architect on our church. And he died in St. Paul in 1925, but was returned to Massachusetts and is buried back in Massachusetts. Next slide. Okay, back to you, Laura.
Actually, we can put the slides down for a minute. At the very end of our program tonight, we will read the original Bond of Fellowship that William Channing Gannett wrote, but we thought we'd just take a little time for questions and comments and observations that you might want to make. And I see that Bob has already put a question in the chat. Do we know the architect who designed the downtown church? Anyone on the teaching team happen to know the answer to that? I'm seeing shaking heads. I'm sorry, Bob, we're going to fail you there. Next program, we'll do that one. We'll find that out for you. Other comments or questions, observations you'd like to make? And Dana's asking, will this recording be available for us? And yes, it will be. Shelley, you're raising your hand.
So I just quickly looked in Eliotto's The Story of Unity Church to see if I could find the architect. And she doesn't seem to name the architect, but she does say that 3 contractors' bids were submitted and the job was awarded to the lowest bidder, G.W. Merrill. That's all I know about that.
Thank you, Shelley. And maybe say again the name of this book and hold it up so people can, because where can they get their hands on this book, Shelley?
Well, this is the original, The Story of Unity Church by Eliotto. But just last year, we did a reprint edition of this book with added photos and some updated information. And you can find that in the Unity bookstall. And I believe it's in the library already.
Thank you.
Also, as long as we're talking about books,
Yeah.
I have to hold up Sacred Place.
Thank you.
Which is a wonderful, wonderful book about our church building and all the church buildings that we used.
Written by
Pauline Eichten and Ellen Green, our own Unitarian historians.
Thank you, Shelley, for that. Barbie Byers is putting in the chat, things most commonly believed today among us, print it in the newsletter. Wouldn't that would be a fascinating idea, wouldn't it? Is there a place where people can get their hands on that, the things most commonly believed among us?
Yes, we do have something called the Unity Online Library, which is links to various documents and books written by our ministers and about Unity Church. And that link is available on the website, Unity website. I believe that statement is there. If not, I will double check, make sure it is.
Super, thank you. Lisa posted in the chat, the Temperance Movement was tied closely to the Industrial Revolution early in progress. Is that what I think it was saying? Kirsten, anything to add to that?
Yes, Lisa's absolutely right. And I would add to that it also had a lot to do with concern about immigrants from Ireland and Germany, thought already to be, well, especially if they were Catholic, not of the same kind of Protestant work ethic. They were suspected of being inherently lazy, degenerate, and really likely to slide into destitution and prostitution for that matter, right? So a lot of this temperance movement is really unsavory to us now because so much of it really reeks of religious intolerance and xenophobia. And so, it's a double-edged thing, the temperance movement. It's hard to love it outright, and, for all kinds of reasons. And I think that that's why I was so struck by what I read in that pamphlet that suggested a much more gentle, generous, and tolerant version. It's really very striking.
Thank you, Kirsten. Hal is asking, does anyone know how the process of calling ministers got gelled in the UUA? I'm not sure that I can speak to that historically. Anyone else here today?
Laura?
Yeah, go ahead, Jim.
I'm here. Okay. So, Hal, remember we did a program and the history teaching team early in the year. It was pretty much on the 17th century. Remember, Bill told us about the Pilgrims, and Kirsten taught us about Winthrop and the City on the Hill, and Richard and I talked a bit about the Cambridge platform. And as I recall, that's where calling comes from, at least in congregational churches. And I think the Unitarians took that on, that it was a decision of the congregation. We don't have a bishop who assigns us clergy the way other Protestant, and not just Roman Catholic or Orthodox ones do, but the congregation makes that decision. So I think it really was a 1648 and after decision, is what I recall. But as far as when the American Unitarian Association wrote that out about the process for calling a minister, sounds like the late 19th century.
And Bob, did you want to add some? Bob Peskin, I saw you. Oh, okay. Thanks. Thank you, Jim. And I'll just read another thing that Lisa posted about the temperance movement. 19th century, because workers would be drinking all day at work and would not be sober, i.e. more industrial accidents than drinking during the weekend, hence the term Blue Monday. And Carrie, I think when considering the temperance movement, it's easy to forget that there wasn't much in the way of mental health care. I'm moved by the way my home church chose to deal with these issues. It's such a wonderful path laid out. As was said, heresies become orthodoxy. Thanks, Carrie. Other questions or comments that you'd like to make? Well, thank you so much for being here. To close out our program, we're going to put the slide back up of the Unity Church original bond of fellowship. And how about we all read this together to close? As those who believe in religion, as those who believe in freedom, fellowship, and character in religion, as those who believe that the religious life means thankful, trustful, loyal, and helpful life, as those who believe that a church is a brotherhood of helpers, wherein it is made easier to lead such a life, we who have joined ourselves together, name, hand, and heart, as members of Unity Church, welcome you right heartily to our fellowship. And today, with you and with each other, we do thankfully renew our bond of faith, of consecration, and of brotherhood. Thank you so much, everybody.